Howdy, all of you delicious people. I am here today to do kind of an oddball like project. So, when going into this, I think a lot of people would take the Power Rangers show and go, "Hey, like this one Power Ranger relates to me. This one Power Ranger is somebody that I would want to be. This one Power Ranger is like basically someone that I could really relate to." I am going to be doing a different approach. And ultimately, I'm going to go into what if I myself was my own Power Ranger, saying my own Power Ranger. Not saying that ultimately, if I were to be on a Mighty Morphin Power Rangers show, I would ultimately be Dragon Zord, Tyrannosaurus Rex, Mastodon, whatever. Instead, I am creating my own original Power Rangers character that ultimately, through certain kind of sketches or certain kind of drawings or certain kind of uh, tablet devices to ultimately showcase visual things, I'm going to showcase if I were on certain Power Rangers seasons up into a certain one. Um, Here are the characters that I would like to be. So, more than likely, most of these visuals, it's not going to be, for the most point, showcasing a window of myself. It's probably just going to be like whatever visual preference that I like. I would ultimately like to be this kind of ranger. So, every single one of these Power Rangers are going to be made up Rangers, more than likely with a number of kind of very small window of themes of certain kind of things. I'm trying as much as possible not to duplicate a lot of Rangers. So ultimately, if I go into, there are numbers of vastly different dinosaur seasons of Power Rangers. There are numerous different just kind of ninja themed or samurai themed or whatever. At the end of the day, we are going out of our way through Mighty Morphin Power Rangers till Dino Thunder, showcasing what all I would like to be ultimately. And then eventually, I think part two, if people enjoy this, I will go on to SPD, to what is now currently Power Rangers Beast Morphers, and ultimately give some visual representation of what I would like to be. Here's the thing, when I was drawing all these things out, I was trying to stick with the styles of the shows. So like I was trying to stick with the facial designs and stuff like that. I was trying to very much like kind of mimic some of the Rangers, so that way it looks kind of like that same style, but more than likely there might be some slight adjustments that I do, or there might be just some slight tweaks and stuff like that. So, yeah, here's just a window into me ultimately saying, like, hey, I love Power Rangers, so ultimately here's what I would be if I was on a number of sets of any one of these things. Here's the character that I would enjoy being. So, like, let's set up a story of sorts. So, let's just say there is a Power Ranger that ends up getting lost in the Morphin Grid, and he ends up very much being to be trapped in the Morphin Grid, and he is supposed to be placed within every single season. If there were to ever have been a Power Ranger that ended up going down, or if the entire Power Ranger team ended up getting killed, this cat would be the replacement. This person would be the replacement member for an entire team of Power Rangers or an individual team of Ranger that it would end up going down. Because ultimately, I would assume that either any one of the Power Ranger Esh like things would have a contingency plan, and you would assume that reasonably, like, there would always be some kind of setup to ultimately go into, okay, well, um, if every single Ranger just gets killed off, which you never ever see happen, then this person would step in and be the filler of time, filler of shoe, filler of whatever. So that's kind of my story, I guess. So let's get into all these choices. Let's get into all these seasons. Again, I could only come up with right now to the current second of this recording from Mighty Morphin Power Rangers all the way to Dino Thunder, which is a lot to ask for. And some of the visuals make sense. Some are just kind of like quick tosses because there's some seasons that I don't really care for, or that ultimately kind of the visuals are just kind of like, hey, this might look cool, but I don't know. So let's go on to the ultimate ideas of which I have per every season. Let's pause here. All right. So, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, the only thing that really kind of sticks into my head is the fact that, like, there are very much of course, at first, a dinosaur like theme. And so, reasonably, I would go into looking into Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. I'm like, well, there are some very much extinct like animals, and so kind of when looking and like I had some ideas of like, well, if you were to ever reboot like a dinosaur esh like themed Power Rangers, more than likely I would actually like, especially if I'm doing the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers like style, I would very much go with a an animal called Megalodon, which is a giant shark-like character. I know at some point we do and have had a shark Power Ranger, which I think was on Wild Force, but when looking at it, that the visual of that Wild Force Ash like Ranger kind of is a little bit kind of a little bit just it's like it doesn't really have much of a vastly interesting approach to it. And so yeah, like kind of when looking at it, like I went with this kind of much more visual just because it kind of showcases like a shark head, and then ultimately more than likely you probably have like eyes in the side of the helmet. But yeah, like looking at it, like I would probably like I don't like the little like teeth ridges that the original Mighty Morphin Power Ranger series had. But when looking at it, I had to go through the style and do it in which the style is done. So I forcibly had to do this way. Ultimately, if I were to actually do it in the way that I would have liked it, basically I would have like blacked out all the little gaps in between and just done this that way. But when looking at it, yeah. So me doing a megalodon like character, it's not because I have any affinity for like sharks. It's not like I'm a shark person. I just chose megalodon because reasonably when looking at it, one, it's a Jurassic like character, and plus there's quite a bit of fun things that you can do with this character. You could call him via short, you could probably call him the Ocean Ranger because his color is the color of the ocean. Ultimately, you could call him Mega Ranger as a shorter abbreviated thing instead of calling him like the Megalodon Ranger, and you don't want to call him Ocean Ranger, and you don't want to call him Aquamarine Colored Ranger because Aquamarine is kind of like a light bluish, um, which ultimately this character would look like. I would and unless you want to call him Aqua Ranger, which I think there's an entire alien Power Ranger thing of that, which ultimately I completely skipped over because I don't really care for the Alien Rangers. Ultimately, I think there's some seasons that I would probably very much just say, hey, yeah, I'm not going to be involved in those seasons, but hey, once those seasons are over, like call me back in, and I'd be more than willing to be a part of so and so season that happens after that. Um, I think as you'll probably see later on, there are some seasons that ultimately I would have easily just said, you know what, like I'm not like I'm not going to be involved in this season because I just don't care for this certain particular season. And so me coming up with an idea of what Ranger I would look like in this season in which I don't care about was just kind of rough for me to just try to just at some point come up with some ideas. And if anything, there's some kind of Power Rangers in certain seasons where their helmets are just really overly complicated. And so that's what, yeah, you'll eventually see. So moving on. So we go from Mighty Morphin Power Rangers to the Ninjetti series that usually comes right after the, of course, Power Rangers movie. So when going into this, I had some kind of reservations. I had some kind of crossroads to think about. So when going into this, I have two different ideas of what I could do for when we get to the Ninjetti series because I know that is coming up furthermore after this. So when looking at this, you can approach this Ninjetti series as two different things in my mind. And probably whoever would like things much more better, probably have a much more better idea. Because ultimately, here's the thing. I think it very much hugely annoyed me that the Rangers did not adjust their helmets when it came from Mighty Morphin Power Rangers to the Ninjetti series. Like, basically, Adam still had the Mastodon helmet that didn't match his spirit animal, which was, of course, a toad. Falcon, of course, was still the White Tiger helmet. Saber-Tooth Tiger was, I guess, a bear, which kind of makes sense. And basically, like, Kimberly's thing was still a crane, so I guess that quasi matched up. But if anything, there was a lot of things where it was just kind of like, okay, like we're really kind of stretching here. Like if anything, even Billy's kind of helmet, like quasi barely got into matching the whole wolf thing. So yeah, just like, yeah. So let's go into my Ninjetti choices. So here is my idea. So ultimately, you can basically just switch the Megalodon like color, and this is kind of a very much brighter green. I probably would have went with a much more darker green, but this is the choice of which that I could easily have gone with. So hear me out here. Ultimately, we can just make a tweak in color of the Megalodon helmet, and ultimately I could go as a Komodo dragon. ultimately knowing full well that there is a dragon off the table, because ultimately Tommy is now the Falcon Ranger. Even before that, he was the White Tiger Ranger. Well, I could be the Komodo Dragon Ranger, and ultimately I could be the Green Ninjetti Ranger because green is not taken. But also, if I were to completely 100% change my helmet, which legitimately everyone should have done via the movie of the Power Rangers, I would honestly go with the spirit animal manta ray, because ultimately, hear me out. You could easily just call me the Manta Ray Ranger, or ultimately, more than likely, I would probably go with like some kind of maybe like a gray or like a chrome or some kind of interesting ash like color. Um, if I were to change my color to gray, I could be called the Gray Manta Ray Ranger. And that'd be kind of cool. That'd be kind of interesting. This design kind of feels like the Masked Rider. Like if you kind of went into the series of the Masked Rider, and especially like the Carmen kind of things, like this kind of approach looks very much like the Masked Rider. And ultimately, I guess, like ultimately when looking at this, the Power Rangers probably wouldn't go with this kind of design because ultimately maybe quite easily they couldn't figure out that this could be a manta ray. But I don't know. I just kind of went with kind of like a goofy, kind of Power Ranger-ish like approach. It's kind of weird looking, and ultimately no one could know what this is. But if you Google the word manta ray, like you can kind of see kind of this kind of a like you can kind of see it through certain kind of angles and stuff like that that you can ultimately understand what I was trying to do here. Um, Kind of a rough sketch, but at the end of the day, anyways, could be any number of different kind of approaches as far as color. You could probably still go with like the Ocean Ranger kind of theme or the Ocean Color kind of theme. Ultimately, like hopefully trying as much as possible to not clash with, of course, Billy being the Blue Ranger. You got to find some kind of blue equivalent or some kind of color equivalent. Ultimately, this could be working very well. Like, I think that this would work well as like a gold color. Like, you could have a lot of like gold and black kind of mixed together, and I think that would work perfectly. So I would probably be the Gold Ranger before like Zeo, which is actually kind of perfect for me to be the very first Gold Ranger before Jason ends up becoming the Gold Ranger. So yeah, ultimately Manta Ray was just something where I was just kind of looking at a very interesting looking uh, aquatic thing, and because ultimately when thinking about it, several of the like Power Rangers had very odd like animals uh that you don't hear of every day. Like the crane was like, what the F is that? The falcon, I'm like, okay, I can maybe understand that. The toad, I was like, why the toad? Like the toad sounds like a very odd thing to have it be a Power Ranger-ish like thing, but I guess they couldn't figure out like what to do with a mastodon because evidently they could have just had a common elephant, just be like, okay, well, hey, Adam, you're the Elephant Ranger, and he would have just had to suck it up and been fine with that. But instead, it didn't seem like they could come up with an easily equivalent of figuring out what to do with Adam, so they just made him a Toad Ranger, which is like, okay, sure. So now, again, I am mentioning I don't want any much of ties with the Alien series. I think for me, I don't want to be a young kid again, and then also I don't want to be Alien Ranger, because knowing full well, if I was an Alien Ranger, one, I would have to completely 100% change species. But then again, it would just be very difficult for me to want to be an Alien Ranger. No offense to those cats. No offense to anybody that loves the Alien Ranger series. Um, I think the Alien Ranger guys recently, like every single one of them, it's just basically okay. Well, every single one of their costumes all look the same, so it's basically just pick a color. Like basically, you're gonna see when I talk about Power Rangers in space. Ultimately, it's gonna be basically like pick a color because they all look the exact same. So we're ultimately going to have to just push on into Power Rangers Zeo. And ultimately, I'm going to showcase my idea of who I would ultimately like to be when ultimately we get into Power Rangers Zeo. So, ultimately, this is kind of a very interesting Ash-like design because I was really stymied thinking of like, okay, well, ultimately, if we're gonna go into a Zeo thing, it has to be like some kind of symbol of sorts. I was kind of looking at symbols and I'm like, well, it kind of looks like any of the Zeo symbols or anything that you could probably easily toss on in some text somewhere. So at first I was looking at maybe an X symbol or maybe a cross symbol as it being, or like a plus symbol to maybe be like a white ranger and you to have like a red cross or something like that. Could be like a healer kind of Zeo Ranger. But then I settled on like, oh my god, wait a minute. If we are going to have an Egyptian like character that ultimately is, of course, the Gold Ranger in this series, I'm like, why not have a knight theme? Why not have like a medieval times character being placed into this show? So here's my kind of process through this. So I went into here and went with this design. Ultimately, like basically, this is a combination of certain kind of helmets all melded into one, and there was some kind of like trials and tribulations of figuring out how to adjust this visual. But I think it looks pretty interesting. It looks kind of cool. It's probably very simple, but still. Here's my idea for this one. So ultimately for this character, you can kind of break it down into two names. I was thinking of calling this the Shining Knight Ranger, ultimately alluding to medieval times, like having this guy in a Knights of the Round Table like armor, which I think would honestly be pretty sweet to have like a character that has like a Power Ranger armor made out of probably iron or steel, just like in the old medieval times. So Shining Knight Zeo Ranger would be an interesting name. Or ultimately, you could call me the Steel Ranger, which sounds kind of odd. Or the Iron Zeo Ranger. But ultimately, yeah, this would kind of either way still be like a knight kind of ranger. So maybe it could just be simply called Night Ranger. It sounds like Knight Rider, but still, yeah. But it would be kind of a cool looking theme. Ultimately, I think the way of which that I would want to approach the armor of this character would probably be like a steampunk-ish like thing, because like a lot of people like steampunk. So yeah, it would be a Zeo Ranger that, of course, ties into medieval times because again, we have like some kind of Egyptian pharaoh-ish like theme going on with Jason's Gold Ranger. So like I think in kind, I'm like, yeah, like I liked the whole pyramid pharaoh-ish like thing. I'm just kind of dipping into in past times and just going like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if I were to be a armored up Zeo Ranger? It'd be kind of cool. So moving on. So we go from Zeo to now Power Rangers Turbo. And to be brutally honest, like Power Rangers Turbo isn't to me up to very much any high regard. And plus, reasonably, going into Power Rangers Turbo, the idea behind that is basically to, like, okay, your Power Ranger is just to be made out of some car. And by and large, I wasn't thinking of any car that was really exciting enough to figure out how to make a helmet out of. So when looking at this, I went into just going, oh my god, like, here's an idea. How about I make a Power Rangers Zeo helmet out of seemingly movie and or show like cars? It's like, oh, here's how I can make a workaround. So ultimately, I decided to make a white Turbo Ranger. Basically, my Zord will be Ecto-1 from Ghostbusters. So ultimately, because I am very much a person that loves like paranormal or supernatural-ish like things, so ultimately when looking at it, I'm kind of mashing Power Rangers and Ghostbusters all together in one, just because for especially this season, like I don't hold Turbo in very much high regard, and then two, there wasn't anything really like creatively interesting for me to do anything with any kind of cars to make a real Ranger out of basically any number of real deal cars. So I just went with a movie car. So that's what I just went with. Yeah, this one was kind of quickly sketched together. So if anything, yeah, like kind of with the way this looks, kind of feels that way. So anyways, because Turbo is just not in any high regard to me. So ultimately, I just like I beshawled all that idea of just going like, well, how would I stick with this? But again, I will do like the celebrity cars, like movie cars, and just end up being that idea. Like there is some kind of workarounds for me because ultimately I love certain kind of things, and there's certain seasons where you have a severely limited choice to what you're going to be ultimately. So you're just kind of forced to just go like, well, like I don't like like I don't really like how I'm gonna try to have to figure this out. So how would I just put this out there and hopefully people enjoy it? So Ecto Turbo Ranger, that's the idea of this one. Moving on. So in space, so Power Rangers in space, basically this season is pick a color, pick any color. So basically, considering there's only a very certain portion of color schemes of which you can go into for Power Rangers in space. I love Power Rangers in space. It's a great season. It kind of concludes the whole Mighty Morphin series for me. So ultimately, I would actually love to be a part of Power Rangers in space. The only thing is, it's like, well, what color would be interesting enough to very much be a interesting looking character? And so ultimately what I ended up doing was like, well, okay, I'm going to be very much a second fiddle like character. I'm not going to be like the sixth ranger or something like that. So I'll just be like one of the guys in the crowd. So what I ended up deciding is that I was going to be the Violet Ranger because it sounds like violence, but it's violet. So I'm going to be the Violet in Space Ranger because ultimately it's an interesting color. It's um, a character that more than likely will probably get confused with Blue Ranger because it kind of quasi looks like blue. But I don't know, if you probably go purple enough, more than likely people could tell the difference. But um, yeah, when looking at it, there's only so few color schemes that you can go with. And so I went with violet, or I went with just purple. Because ultimately, like, what was I going to be? Like the crap brown ranger, which kind of sounds funny. But because ultimately, that's probably what I would go with at some point, would just be like, hey, yeah, I'll just be the brown ranger. And so, yeah, in space, basically pick a color. Moving on. So, we are now going into the oddball-ish like seasons, and so for reasons like you kind of have to just kind of figure out what the F any of these seasons were and what were their themes. So, when going into Power Rangers Lost Galaxy, the things that I had learned were like to figure out if there are some certain galaxies or there's some certain, like, it comes down to like space um astrology or whatever. It comes down to like when looking at the characters, there was like some kind of um very much like, I think there was like a Taurus, and there was like a Leo, and there was like all these like astronomical uh kind of significance. So when looking at this thing here, like, it comes off as being like, man, this doesn't look like a Power Ranger. It looks like a villain that they're gonna fight this week. I don't know. I kind of like the way of which that I went about this was I was looking through a bunch of just random ish like space things, and I came across like, because I was searching, I'm like, okay, what is a an outer space signia that has an animal tie? And so otherwise I came across like Crab Nebula. And I was like, okay, well, then crab is what will be. Crab is crab doesn't get used a lot on Power Rangers, because ultimately they can probably have a very severely difficult time trying to figure out what the Zord will be. Um, yeah, so I went with like a crab Lost Galaxy Ranger. Ultimately, more than likely, it would forcibly have to be like a very much orange-esh like character. So ultimately, if I would be the orange Lost Galaxy like character, I guess that's who I'd end up being. Um, I was kind of like not really quite exactly trying to like, I couldn't quite figure out exactly what color scheme to make the eye portion of this costume, but when looking at it, like, I remember like Amazing Spider-Man that would ultimately have like these white like lenses, and so ultimately that's kind of what I went with here, as looking at just like, okay, well, this character is just gonna have like very white like lenses, and that's how he's going to eventually see. So anyways, the Lost Galaxy Ranger from Crab Nebula, I guess. That is what this character is. More than likely, this was kind of like an interesting, just kind of like trying to figure out like how this character will work. And so like this is just kind of like the rough draft of what could ultimately be maybe an interesting character that ends up being jockeying for position later on to have a much more different design, or maybe cleaner approach. But anyways, moving on. So, Lightspeed Rescue. So when going into this, I was like, you know what? I like Lightspeed Rescue. There's some interesting things going on there. I watched like the first 20 some odd episodes of this, but you know what? Like with Lightspeed Rescue, there's a severely limited like there's a fireman, there's a police officer, there's a uh, all kinds of rescue people, paramedic, this and that. I'm like, how am I gonna fit into all of this stuff? But then I remember on the pilot episode, really it seemed like there were some ghosts that seemed to come out of some cave in the very pilot episode. And so I'm like, you know what? Like sticking with like a paranormal like theme because again, I like supernatural less like stuff. I'm like, well, what if within the series like there was just some supernatural esh like people like because when looking at it like ghost hunters and stuff like that is probably ghost hunters is a real thing. So you would think any number of people would have like ghost calls or like ghost emergencies and stuff like that. So I don't know. Like, I'm not saying call me now for a free reading, but ultimately, I kind of just went with this character to where ultimately, when looking at this, I kind of was trying to like come up with color schemes, and ultimately, I really banked on the fact I'm like, what if like I could reverse the color palette of the Lightspeed Rescue Ranger, and instead of making it, I could make the whites black, and then ultimately the rest of the big color of the Ranger I could make like a white or like an off white, and that's what kind of really interests me. And ultimately, I was like, you know what, like ultimately this via a little bit more detail or something like that like this character could look very much more interesting and this and that. But yeah, so Lightspeed Rescue White Ranger ultimately via the supernatural rescue of sorts. I don't know, I just kind of it was either that or I would just be like a hazmat character, which ultimately I was like it's like I've dealt with hazmat esh like stuff in the past, and so because ultimately like there was some hazmat stuff that you have to emergencyly get to because there's some stuff where you have um like things go horribly awry and a hazmat person has to go and kind of solve things. So it was either supernatural emergency like person or it's going to be probably a hazmat person, and I went with this instead. So yeah, Lightspeed Rescue. Moving on. So here's my conundrum. So within Power Rangers Time Force, we have a litany of several different designs that are for these are for these characters. And here's my biggest, hugest qualm. So, a lot of these designs for these Lightspeed Rescue Rangers are kind of like the normal, like heart shapes and just arrows and stuff like that. And you have the most perfect design that actually involves time, and you did not go with that at all. You did not go with the shape of an hourglass. So, like, immediately when I was going into Time Force, I was like, you know what? I'm not thinking of Time Force as I gotta have a design that fits some kind of Zord. I gotta have some design that fits some kind of something. No, I immediately was like, you know what? I'm gonna go with an hourglass because that is actually the thing that perfectly fits within the theme of Power Rangers Time Force. How they don't have an hourglass or some kind of representation of time on their team makes no sense to me. So I would, of course, be the Black Ranger, the Hourglass Ranger, I guess. The Hourglass Black Ranger, I guess. So yeah, Time Force. Never thought to have an hourglass visual. More than likely, maybe the first sketches of Power Rangers Time Force, maybe they were all having hourglass-like designs. But maybe they're like, no, we need to break it up and have them be like having several different designs. And so they maybe completely scrapped the whole hourglass thing completely. Because more than likely, maybe they all had the exact same design on all of them, which was an hourglass, and they all had different colors. So, anyways, the Hourglass, Black Ranger, Time Force. Moving on. So, in this, we are now going into Power Rangers Wild Force. So, really, when going into this one, I was like, well, you have to kind of pick a wild animal. So the list of that was, of course, fairly short, and so to me, I'm like, well, some of the good ones were already taken, of course, because usually, like, immediately, probably people would go into lions or like a shark or something like that. So I went with simply enough. I'm like, you know what? Wouldn't it be kind of cool to have like a rhinoceros ranger or a rhino ranger? That'd be kind of cool. Like, if anything, like it would be like the color palette would probably be like a gray or a silver or something like that. And like ultimately, I was trying to stick the landing of trying to make a ranger that kind of sticks with the the Wild Force design, but this kind of is probably maybe off kilter, just kind of going upon its own thing. But yeah, so yeah, Rhino Ranger, kind of a very bizarre Ash-like concept, but I was like, you know what, like, F it. It's just, it's one of those where it's like Wild Force. It's like, when watching the pilot, I was kind of like, I don't very much like Wild Force. Like, I don't know. Like, I think when looking at it, more than likely, if I was to retire at any point of being a ranger, maybe Wild Force would be it. It's like, you know what? I'm going to sit out on this season, as well as sitting out on probably some other season that I'm probably going to be mentioning fairly soon as well. Probably sitting out and just because ultimately, like, for certain Power Rangers, like a lot of Power Rangers aren't exactly getting paid anyways, unless you're probably like government funded. Which, how many very few Power Ranger seasons are actually government funded or whatever? Like very few. So a lot of times it just ends up being like the Power Rangers are just kind of like sifting off into anywhere, and like, yeah, they're not exactly like getting like millions and millions of dollars for being a Mighty Morphin Power Ranger or an In Space Ranger or whatever. And I think once they kind of went into the later seasons like SPDs and stuff like that, like I think they actually like went and did a lot of like smarter things to help us understand that like there's a whole like way of them like compensating the Rangers for doing a job. So moving on. Whoa. So now we go into Power Rangers Ninja Storm. And recently for Ninja Storm, if there is one Power Rangers season that I don't think that I really want to be a part of, it's Ninja Storm. Because ultimately for Power Rangers Ninja Storm, I watched the pilot, I'm like, this is the goofiest show. This is the hands down goofiest Power Ranger show. If anything, like the Power Rangers the three that I mostly saw all talk like they're Keanu Reeves, and basically Power Rangers Ninja Storm is not, it's not really something that I really want to be part of. I think that's again another season where it's gonna be like me retiring, going off into a beach somewhere, and like letting the or maybe being a mentor Jason David Frank was. Maybe I'll be the mentor ranger that pops in from time to time and tells people what for. Um, but yeah, but I'm not gonna be because ultimately when going into Time Force, I will have been through a many spectrum of time. So ultimately, like, I'm probably not a person, like, maybe I'm immortal, a person that lives forever. And so ultimately, when looking at it, I can be in any plethora of time, decade, whatever year, because it doesn't matter. And so ultimately, like, time is moot to me. Um, but then ultimately, when someone will probably tell me, hey, you want to be a Ninja Storm Ranger? Like, no. So my idea ultimately was to play around with something with ninja stars. Basically, my concept would be probably the white ninja star ranger. Ultimately, my concept would be that I would be dealing with my element would be something with cold. More than likely, my power could be like a cold front, or just having something to do with like sub zero kind of things, like freezing people, or having like sub zero kind of like powers or something like that. Would maybe be like the side thing is like everything would be kept cool, and this and that. So ultimately that could be my elemental thing, because I think a lot of the characters have some kind of elemental thing in this season. It seems like one person has like wind, water, and this and that. Kind of like how Power Ranger Samurai is. It's kind of like the elements. So yeah, Power Rangers Ninja Storm. Just a bizarrish concept. Moving on. So ultimately, this would be Dino Thunder. Ultimately, when looking at it, when you have, and this will probably be my last one, and then ultimately we'll eventually pick up at some point when I can get sketches for figuring out how other Rangers through other seasons are going to look like. So, my concept, and this one is very rougher than others. My concept for Dino Thunder is that ultimately, since my last name is Griffin, anyways, ultimately knowing full well that I have already been a Dino Ranger at some point, more than likely there is also Dino Charge coming as well. When looking at it, like, Tommy was the dragon Green Ranger in Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, and I'm like, well, so like what? Can we actually have like mythical characters as Power Rangers? Like, so instead of it just being like instead of it just having to be a dinosaur, you can just have a mythical creature that it seemingly at some point like has some real lore to it. Because ultimately I'm like, well, you know what, F it. Like, then I would be Dino Thunder. I would be the bronze Dino Thunder Griffin Ranger. That's what I would be. Ultimately, would work perfectly with my name. So ultimately, yeah, I will be the Bronze Ranger. Um, yeah. Ultimately, people could say it's like, well, clearly this is brown. Like, I would say, like, no, it's very much a bronze. And so he'll be the Bronze Ranger, because ultimately you have you have kind of like that gold flake kind of going on in their uniforms anyways. Like if anything I would have like a quasi kind of like color scheme that ultimately maybe they could change instead of having it be like a gold thing, maybe it could have some kind of adjustment to where maybe my color scheme will be white. So it would be bronze and like white for Dino Thunder, or maybe it would be like maybe instead of like gold, maybe it'll be yellow. Because I don't know, I'm trying to come up with like a good color scheme for Griffin, and ultimately knowing full well it's like you got a bird and you got a lion and it's combined with one another. Yeah, I'm trying to come up with like the perfect like design. So ultimately, when looking at this, like yeah, this design was really rough. Me trying to figure out exactly what to do with this one, because there's several different iterations of Griffins, and I know like during one early on Mighty Morphin Power Ranger season, there was a Griffin as a Zord, which I thought was interesting. But looking at that, I'm like, okay, you couldn't tell that that was exactly a Griffin. I think that's when they were starting to mix in some kind of like Egyptian like Zords at some point. So anyways, yeah. This one is the last idea that I had. So yeah, kind of yeah, this is the last one that I had so far. So ultimately we're probably going to go at some point to go into figuring out what is going to be uh what is going to end up being SPD to Power Rangers Beast Morphers and Beyond. I think I know that there is probably some other Power Rangers season coming after Beast Morphers. I know that there might be also a Power Rangers Dino Knights coming, which is kind of weird. It kind of seems like a barrage of two mixture of different kind of things together. Um, but that might be cool. So yeah, so I like recently, if any of these sketches were something that interests anybody or whatever, ultimately at the end of the day, more than likely it would be kind of interesting to eventually see, uh, like maybe people have different kind of approaches to any of these drawings, and maybe they want to send me, uh, you want to send me any artwork of your own, and email me. You can probably do that, maybe. If ultimately, yeah, just kind of comment down below, and ultimately uh, I'll probably send you an email that you can send me stuff. More than likely, if you have a better technical drawing apparatus, maybe there's some real true artists out there um, to send me any kind of sketch art or artwork or something like that. Yeah, it would be kind of interesting to see in the future, like what we can make out of all this. Um, but yeah, these are just rough ideas, rough sketches. Ultimately, some of these are kind of like stuff that has been brewing around for years, but most of them are just kind of like a couple days now, just going and just going like, yeah, like here's my idea, and just going and riffing off of it. So ultimately, more than likely, any number of these things could eventually change. A lot of people could probably want certain kind of things for certain kind of seasons. Just be like, well, no, like if anything, like you should have the exact same thing of this. Like there's probably a lot of people that actually know full well the designs of certain characters and stuff like that, and could adjust any of these certain characters based on certain parameters, certain kind of masks or certain kind of helmets or whatever. That'd be great. But at the end of the day, this is all I have to say about all these ideas of mine. Told me to go, hey, yeah, wouldn't it be cool if I was XYZ Ranger and this and that. Recently, at the end of the day, that's all I want to say. So yeah, some interesting ideas from past Power Ranger seasons. More than likely, probably a lot of people would end up asking me, it's like, well, hey, like, what would be a new concept Power Ranger idea? Like, I think that they need to probably go with some kind of old fashioned Esh like things, not going to the dinosaurs again. Um, More than likely, you can kind of go like myths and legends routes, where ultimately you can have like some. Maybe you can have like a Cyclops Ranger. Maybe you could have like a there's a lot of lore on certain like old fashioned like uh things that people sketch like griffins and stuff like that. You could probably do a whole thing about that. I know there's somebody out there that's doing like Power Rangers Relic for concepts, so maybe go with that series. But anyways, I'm gonna get out of here because I've already been talking for 55 minutes, so I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.